All right, I think I'm going to change this around in that we are going to go over the stuff I said we're going to go over today. Ideally, we're going to finish everything else that's in this thing. Next week, rather than looking at asynchronous, that book I gave you, etc., I just would like us to do some coding. I think that that'll help. So, all right, this section is entitled the HTML DOM or document object model. I've said this before. I said this the other day to the new people that if you can learn how to program the DOM, there's really nothing on a web page you can't do. All right. When you create a web page, this DOM, a picture, something similar to what you see on the screen here, gets created for you automatically. All right. And really, it's the DOM and manipulating the DOM with JavaScript that allows dynamicity in a website. All right, from the stuff, especially the stuff we've been doing so far. So they've got about 8 or 10 lessons in here. I'm not going to sit there and read to you what is the DOM. You can take a look at that stuff yourself. But down at the bottom of this, they say, what is the HTML DOM? All right. Notice again, it defines elements as objects. And those elements have properties and methods that you can run on them. That's the key thing. And they respond to different events. All right. Now, as far as some of the methods, etc., we talked a little bit yesterday about inner HTML. You use inner HTML to basically it's a DOM-related method where you can write to anything on a web page. It's not document.write where you just write something on the screen. No, typically you're writing, you might have a paragraph, except, in a popular example of this is maybe everybody in the world can go out to a certain website. For example, I go out to it's called medium.com. They got a lot of articles on Node.js. And probably what I'm going to end up doing starting next month is for $5 a month, you can subscribe to it. Okay? And I might probably do it for September, October, November, and December because I just need it for those 4 months, And I might keep it. I don't know. We'll see how it goes. But the point is, you get about 10 free articles a month. I burned through those puppies on the first day. So then after that, you get the beginning to where they start to get to the good stuff, and then it says, if you want this, you got to have, if you want this, you got to have paid access type of thing. Well, so what does this have to do with anything? Well, again, what you can do with stuff like this is you can, as an example, give a view of everything to everybody, or a limited view to everybody, and then a regular, a view to people who subscribe or do whatever. It's interesting. My kids have the Disney Channel. I don't know if she put it on our TV or what. I don't have any idea. But I don't watch because I don't watch any of that stuff. But I said there was a commercial on it for that Mulan regular movie that's coming. And I said, oh, you guys gonna watch it? And they said, no, that's the other version of Disney Plus where you have to pay more. All right, I didn't even know there was another version of it. So, all right, get element by ID. If you're not comfortable with using get element by ID, again, when you go and you put an ID on anything, you can now, on a web page, you can now manipulate it using JavaScript on the client side with get element by ID. All right. So let's say you don't want to do that. There's also, for example, and you're going to see this either later in here, and if you don't, it's no big thing one way or the other. But there's also get elements by class name, or get elements by tag name. So if you wanted to do something special where you had all sorts of unordered lists throughout an entire web page, you could do get elements by tag name, and you could choose ULs type of thing. Okay, so as it says, the easiest way to get content of an element is by using the inner HTML. You use it to get or put. So in other words, get or set. You can get element from it, or get content from it, or you can assign content to it. All right. The document object, so these are the ones I just mentioned to you. I guess I was a little premature, but again, you can see that right there. And look underneath it how they say you can change this. Now, are we going to do this? We're going to do some of this. This is more stuff we probably should have been doing last semester, to be honest with you. The book that we have, the Muroc book, I mean, I love the people from Muroc. They're some of the nicest people I've ever met in my life, and I think they have good books. I think that what's happened in the past few years is they've changed from very good books to good books, because they leave some stuff out that I think is important. And there's at least a chance that when we come up and in December, when Evan and Paul and I meet, we talk about books, we may not use them anymore. You know, and I'm sure they're going to be a little bit upset. It's not, we're not like a really humongous customer for them, but we've been a very loyal customer to them. So, all right. And again, right underneath the finding, that's how you change it. Okay, so. Next, adding and deleting elements. You can put something on a web page. So, you know, you can either add something to a web page that wasn't there, or you can take stuff that was on a web page that might have been invisible and make it visible, type of an idea. The next one is a pretty big one. If you see this, adding event handlers, you have to be able to understand. We are going to end up writing probably in about 2 weeks. I don't know exactly when, but we're going to write. I told you about that API where we're going to be working with a stock market thing, and we're going to be grabbing stuff. You have to understand how, when you click that button, the JavaScript code you have to put in there to make something happen. All right? And like I said, please remind me if you think about this. Next, they talk about finding objects. Notice that everything that's there starts with the word document. All right. Okay. All right. Again, they've got finding HTML element by ID. You've got to be able to understand this. There's got to be something on the page with an ID of intro. It could be a div, it could be a paragraph, it doesn't really matter. But whatever the contents of that ID intro are now going to be set to my element. Now, right now, what you notice is the document.get element by ID. It's on the right-hand side of the equal sign, right? Which means you're taking what's in there and you're assigning it to something else. If you put it on the left-hand side of an equal sign, then you're going to be assigning a value to that. Okay? All right. And it's not, I mean, you'll see it as we go on. Okay. Because technically with the get, it's the get, you don't put it on the left-hand side, but you can go and assign stuff. All right. Then there's a tag name. So again, notice here, X is going to hold basically an array that's going to hold all the paragraph information. Does that make sense? If it's singular, if it's element, there's one of them. If it's elements, it's 0 or more is the way it's referred to as. And again, I'd suggest if you get some time today or soon where they've got to try it yourself in there, do it. Just try it. Just see exactly what's happening. And if you go through a few of them, you're like, yeah, that's kind of what I thought, fine. But if there's anything in there that you don't know, it'll at least give you a chance to take a quick look at it. Next, they've got finding elements by class name. Remember, the difference is if I do a find element by tag name and I do P, it's going to find all the paragraphs. If I do a find element by, or find elements by class name, it's and if I use, class hello, let's say, which is a stupid name, but if I do that, it's not necessarily just paragraphs that have that. You can put a class on virtually anything, on any type of HTML element. Finding elements by CSS selector. All right. Notice, you see the example that says var x equal document.query selector all? Can you see that? Mm-hmm. All right. As it says, it returns a list of paragraph elements, but since we added a selector on there, only the paragraph elements that have a class of intro associated with them. All right. Now, as it says, it doesn't work in IE 8 and earlier. That shouldn't be a big thing for any of us. All right. Then the next example that's on there finds the form element with an ID of FRM1 in the forms collection, and it displays everything that's in there. And again, not that it's a big thing, but if you do run that one, you see exactly what they're talking about. All right, and as I mentioned, it's kind of important that you go in there and you start to at least get a comfort level with the stuff that's in there. All right. Again, changing HTML. Okay, what you can do typically when you can change existing HTML, you can remove existing HTML, you can modify. All right, when I say you can change existing HTML, you can delete existing HTML, and you can add new HTML. Typically, when you do that, you're working with what are referred to as nodes, but it depends on how you're doing it. So, as it says, there's a thing in document.write there. That's not that important. But going down there, changing content, that's pretty important. Now you see what I mentioned to you. Did you notice how that inner HTML is on the left-hand side of the equal sign? All right. We didn't do much of that last semester. But, simple example. You say to a person, they start up on your web page, and you say to them, what's your favorite color? So you answer blue. Boom. The background color of your screen becomes blue. What's your second favorite color? You say orange. Fine. Now the text on there is orange. If you don't like it, you can change it, but you get the idea. All right. And they've got an example of that in there. So. And they even explain the examples when they put them in there, which is kind of nice. You can also change the value of an attribute, and they show that in there. All right. Why is that important? Notice what you're doing in there is you are changing an image. You're changing the image that's in there. All right. So when you run it, all right, you've got the ability to change an image from one thing to another. This is one way. This isn't really the way you do rollovers, but it would be possible that you could set it up. You could have before and after pictures. You could do all sorts of different types of things with it. And in just the same way, you can change CSS. Right? I'm not saying that you never do this, but typically when you're going to do this, you're going to use jQuery for it. All right? And they give an example in there. It says to change the style of an HTML element, and they show how to do it, and then they show how to change the color for a paragraph, I think it is, to blue. I think that's the one. Yeah. All right. But again, the whole idea is you're doing it dynamically. All right. Okay, using events, the DOM allows you to execute code when an event occurs. Like what? You can set it up so when you click on something, when you mouse over, when you mouse into something and mouse out of something. All right. Again, you've seen all that kind of stuff, right, on different websites. And there's a bunch of like little quizzes or whatever in here. And again, that's why I'm trying to give you some time, because I realize, you said you've got a busy schedule and stuff. So if you want to spend a little bit of time going through this, that's cool. All right. Animations. Most animations on a simple, web page are fairly simplistic. All right. And when you do that, you end up moving, typically the way that you animate is you end up moving stuff around on the screen. If you run that animation that they have in there, it's not much of anything, but it's a way, you can, this is such a classic one. They put a little div inside of a bigger div, and it's a big yellow div, and they put a little red div, so it's a square inside of a square, and you make it move around on the screen or whatever. And again, all this stuff that we're talking about, it is possible also to do it using, if you don't want to do it like this, you can do it using jQuery. So the actual code to go in and start doing this is shown on the bottom of this slide. All right. So now if you click the click me on the very bottom, all it does is it moves down to the bottom. That's it. All right. Now, the way that I look at this is using stuff like animations. You do that for effect, right? You do it for aesthetic reasons. You might want something to fade in because that's really cool as the program, as you get into the web page, or fade out, or do whatever. What you're going to be learning when we get into the node stuff is literally, some of it is, to you is almost, you might say, we already did this. Yeah, we did. But we did it all on what's called the client side. We didn't have a very dynamic web page. You're going to have a dynamic web page. Again, if you remember, towards the end of the year last year in the C# class, we were doing stuff with databases where you could add records, remove records, etc. We're going to be doing that right inside of the database. And inside of the website, and have it immediately be affecting the database. That's where we'll be soon. All right. Next are events. And again, pretty simple example. Okay, do you see? I don't know if you had that one up. You take your mouse and put it where it says mouse over me. Okay, there's a mouse over event. Then there's a click event. Okay. Go ahead and click that other button 3 or 4 times and it'll eventually disappear. That kind of an idea. But as it says, the DOM allows JavaScript to react to events. I will tell you, and I'm not just saying this, Keegan, for you to be able to do the first test, you're going to have to know the stuff that's in this section. It's going to have to make sense to you, or you won't be, you have to know how to program a button. And I don't mean a submit button or a reset button. So if you got a button that says, let's say you have a to-do list, and you have to click a button to go and add an item to your to-do list. You have to know how to actually do that. All right. So events work with event listeners. Okay, the event listener, you look at it this way, that basically the system is sitting there waiting for something to happen. Literally, that's what it's doing. It's sitting there waiting for something to happen. And if nothing happens, it just keeps sitting there. If you click a button, it says, do I have code associated with that button? If it does, you run that code. If it doesn't, you don't do anything. And that's exactly what they're talking about here. So notice the add event listener method attaches an event listener to a specified element. All right. And as it says, it does it without overwriting existing event handlers. So if you'll go down a little further, they show you the syntax for it, and then they show you how you can do it. All right. So with this try under add an event handler to an element to try it yourself, if you click the try it button, this isn't a big thing. All right. But you don't see the alert until you click the try it button. All right, and we're not going to, I told you yesterday, we're not going to work with alerts at all, but the idea is you have to be able to respond to button clicks more than anything else. I mean, that's what the majority of the work that you're going to be end up doing when you're working with event listeners. You can add many event handlers to the same element, and they show an example. It's a pretty simple one. All right, all it does is it brings up two different it brings up two different alerts. So some of the examples they have are kind of stupid examples. All right. There's another one when you resize the window to show you what's going to happen. All right. And this is kind of a big one. I did have you do some of this. You may or may not remember, but if you look at that one, if you run this and you look towards the upper right-hand corner, it shows the size of your window. And if you go in there and resize the window manually, it'll change. That's kind of important because if you remember when we were talking about things like when to set media queries, when to have sizes and stuff change. Okay, that's one way that you can do that. It's much easier because in Bootstrap they've added that stuff, but if you're doing it manually, it's a little bit more work. Event bubbling or event capturing, I think we talked about this before. I'm going to say it again anyway. All right. Let's suppose I've got 3 functions. Okay, so my program calls function 1. Function 1 calls function 2. Function 2 calls function 3. You with me? Just pretty simple. There's an error in function 3. Okay, and typically when you have error handling, what most books will recommend and what most people say is put the error handling right in the routine where the error could occur. If it does that, then if there's an error handler in there, fine, that's cool. But if there isn't one, it bubbles up to whatever called it. So if 2 calls 3, it'll bubble up to 2. If it doesn't find it there, it'll bubble up to 1. If it doesn't find it there, it'll bubble up to the program that the main program that called it. If it's not there, it'll give you an error. That's bubbling up. It can also bubble down or propagate its way down. And in that case, it starts at the top and it goes down. All right, so is it bottom up or is it top down? All right, you can also remove event listeners. So maybe you want it set up so that after you click a button the first time, maybe you want to turn it off. All right, as an example. Let's see. Notice, you may or may not have noticed, but they do have an entire DOM event object reference in here. All right, so if you have any interest, you can take a look at that. Next is DOM navigation. These are the nodes that I talked to you about before. Hopefully that's where you are right now. According to the W3C HTML DOM standard, everything in an HTML document is a node. So there's document nodes, there's element nodes, there's text nodes, there's comment nodes, even blank spaces and stuff like everything in there is a node. And when you come to work, start working with this stuff, they talk about node relationships in here. And it says the nodes in a node tree have a hierarchical relationship with one another. The parent, child, and sibling, okay, are used to refer to the relationships. Notice the root node is at the top. Okay, that's at the very top. Basically, that's your beginning HTML tag. All right. Every node has one parent except the root doesn't have a parent. Every other one does. A node can have any number of children. All right. And siblings are nodes of the same parent. So when you take a look at the picture that's shown there, all right, the root node is the parent node for both the head and the body. The head node and the body node are sibling nodes. Okay. And they show you all that stuff in bulletized list down below that. You can navigate then between nodes. They show this about a third of the way down. It says you can use the following node properties to navigate between nodes with JavaScript. I'm not going to read that, but you can move up and down the DOM is what they're saying. And they give you some examples of that. All right. About halfway down, it says DOM root nodes. There are 2 special properties that allow access to the full document. Document.body and document.document.element. If I want to do something like that, I use document.body. And again, there are some examples of that. The node name property, notice it specifies the name of a node. Why is that important? Because you may end up wanting to use that programmatically. Nodes not only have a name, they have a value, as is shown right there, and they have a type. And you'll notice that not the value, but the node name and the node type are read-only. So once you set them up, they're pretty much set up that way. All right. Now, if you comment out if you comment out some code, then that code might not have been a comment node, and now it is. And then when you uncomment again, it's not a comment node anymore. But it's basically, it's the value that changes in there all the time. The most important node type properties, again, I'm not reading, I want to read to you, is at the bottom of the slide. DOM elements for nodes. Again, notice you can create new nodes, and then they explain that. You have your choice. You can insert something before something, after something, or in place of something. That makes sense? So they remove some stuff, they remove some child nodes, and all this stuff has got explanations to it. And they replace some stuff. All right. DOM collections, down near the bottom of this section, it says the get elements by tag name returns an HTML collection object. It works pretty much like an array, and that's why I mentioned before. It's got a length property, and you can go through, and there's a lot of stuff that you can do. Finally, the last thing they talk about is DOM node lists. And as it says there, the DOM node list object, it's a collection of nodes extracted from a document, and you can do and treat it as though it was an array and do a lot of array-like things with it. Next is the JS Browser Bom. And this is confusing because the DOM is the document object model. The BOM is the browser object model. What does that mean? All right. The DOM is basically the way that you talk to the web page. That makes sense? The BOM is more the way you talk to the browser. So they are really two different things. All right. You know what the window object is, even if you don't think you do. Okay. And what I mean is, for example, you've written alert statements before. You've written prompt statements before. You've done that. I know you have. All right. And even though we never did it that way, it would have been totally legal when you were doing, for example, an alert. You could have written, instead of alert, you could have written window.alert, because the alert is part, basically it's an object of the window class, or however you want to refer to that. All right. Sorry. I don't know why this room must be a little bit different than the other one, because the other one I don't have to clean these things as much. They don't fog up as much. All right, as it says, the window object is supported by all browsers. It represents the browser window. Okay. You can do things, you can play with the size. You saw that in an earlier example. If you go down to the bottom of this particular one, it says right there, other window methods. Okay. So you can open up new windows, close windows, etc. I'm not going to read those to you. You can look at them yourself. The window screen, notice, height, width, etc. The reason that that can be important, all right, is you may want to set a website up so that it cannot, it's almost like, you may remember this from first semester when we would set like a max width property type of thing. That's kind of what you're doing here. But the screen, this will tell you what the screen width and screen height are. Okay. Location, as it says, it can be used to get the current URL and to redirect the browser to a new page. You've seen this before when there's a broken link, and there's a broken link. It's considered really poor programming practice if you've got a broken link and it just sits there. You never want to leave the user hanging. So if there's a broken link, you just want to push them off to another page, do a redirect. The history is next. As it says, it contains the browser's history. Notice there's back and there's forward. When you do the back and the forward, you can also put a number in there to go back X number of pages. All right, of course, if you're on the main page and you go forward, it's forward is 0. You can't go anywhere. The Navigator, as it says, it gives you information about a user's browser. Back in the old days, there were two browsers. there was IE, Internet Explorer, and there was Netscape. And that was it. And sometimes you would see the Navigator used in programs where the user would say, if your browser is Internet Explorer, okay, do this. Else if it's Netscape Navigator, do this. Today there's so many different types of browsers. I'm not saying this isn't used, but it's not used as extensively as it has been in years past. But I mean, again, there are things that you can find out in here, as it says. All right, and they show you the majority of them. You can find out the application name, etc. Browser engine, browser version. I suppose in that case, you could check, and if they were running IE, you could check the version they were running. If they were running an old version, you could tell them, hey, you really should upgrade, type of thing. Pop-up boxes, you know what a pop-up box is. You know what an alert is. You know what a prompt is, and I talked to you a little bit about a confirm. All right. If you look at the confirm, the big thing, if you go to the try it yourself thing for a confirm, and if you click on the try it, all right, notice it's got both an OK and a cancel. All right. The reason that that's important, the OK works just like a regular alert, but the cancel, if you do put some code in there, all right, all it does on here is it says you press cancel. But you might want to, let's say that you're asking somebody if they want to sign up for a web, sign up to subscribe to your service or something, and there's an OK and a cancel. All right. I mean, it's even possible if you press cancel, you might bring up a little form or something and say, why did you decide not to do this? Type of an idea. All right. Again, we've talked about prompt. There's no use in going over that anymore. Now, timing events. This is important. This is literally kind of how we're going to start when we go into the next section. All right. JavaScript is like other programming languages in that it tries the best it can to run synchronously. So if you tell it to do 5 things, it'll do number 1, get done, do number 2, get done, do number 3, get, etc. But you can make it run asynchronously, which means that if you're supposed to do, I mean, let's say as an example, okay, I told you to do something and it was going to take a lot of time. Well, if I just sit here waiting for you to get done, I'm not doing anything. But if I tell you to do something that's going to take a lot of time and I can do something else in the meantime, that's doing things asynchronously. So what does that have to do with timing? You'll see when we start to set timeouts, you'll start to see how you can make things run. So when you do a set timeout, all right, as it says in there, it executes a function after waiting a specified number of milliseconds. So you might tell the system, hey, because JavaScript tries to do stuff synchronously, if you've got 5 or 6 things in a row, sometimes what it'll do is it'll actually start the next thing before it's finished the previous thing. And what'll happen is you might be gathering a list of something and there might be 100 things in it and it might not have found any yet, but then it's already trying to do the next one. It says there's nothing in there. So sometimes what you'll want to do is you'll want to set a timeout and say, hey, just wait for 2 seconds and then do this. So that's the set timeout. You can clear timeouts. So setting a timeout is like setting an alarm. All right, clearing the timeout is like turning the alarm off. Set interval is like playing with a snooze button. All right, so if your interval on your alarm clock is basically set up that every 10 minutes or so it goes off again when you press snooze, then that'd be the interval. And just like there's a set interval, there's a clear interval. All right, they've got a long example at the bottom of the clock that's got some of this in it. But again, I think you understand the idea. Last thing in this section then is they talk about cookies. Do you know what cookies are? Okay. The idea is some people fear cookies. Cookies are not executable. They're small in size. They're typically 4K, 4,000 bytes or less. Most browsers only allow you to have a certain number of cookies because technically cookies can remain in memory indefinitely. So if it let you had hundreds or thousands of them, etc., and you probably have done this already. I know I do. Occasionally I clear out my cache in my machine, and sometimes it'll say you want to clear out your cookies. Well, it remembers things like websites that I've been to, etc., which can make life a little bit easier, all right, and run a little bit faster. So you can create your own cookies. So there's a create a cookie with JavaScript, all right. And that's a real simple one, the first one they show, but you can add more stuff to it. Typically, when you set up a cookie, quite often at least, you put what's called an expiry date on it, and they've got an example right there. Now, if you've got an existing cookie and you give it a new expiry date that's in the past, that's one way to get rid of it. But I could set a cookie right now and I could tell it to expire in 3000. It would. I won't be here for it, but it would. All right. You can read cookies with JavaScript. So notice document.cookie. It returns all cookies in one string. You can change a cookie using JavaScript, and they show this about halfway down. You can delete a cookie with JavaScript. All right. So again, notice they set an expiry date that had already passed. The document.cookie property, it says, looks like a normal text string, but it is not. And they mention there, if you write a whole cookie string to document.cookie, when you read it again, you'll only see the name value appear. And the reason you only see that is that's all that's required. And they've got an example of working. There's a function that sets a cookie, gets a cookie, checks a cookie, etc. And then it puts it all together on the bottom, which is kind of a cool example. All right, then let's jump into the Ajax stuff next. We'll do the Ajax and the JSON. We don't have real much left, but we'll do the Ajax and the JSON. We'll take a break. So Ajax, I already mentioned this to you. Okay, Ajax stands for Asynchronous JavaScript and XML. It's actually not new. It's about now 25 or 30 years old, something like that. But the idea is a partial page refresh. If you've ever gone out to Google Maps or something like that, and you zoom in and you zoom out, it doesn't redraw the whole screen. It only redraws where you are. That's a key thing, and that was a big thing when it happened. And actually, this is one time where accidentally Microsoft did a cool thing, and that is they had this object that was called I think it was XML HTTP request, and somebody figured out, hey, we can use that to do partial page refreshes, and that's how it came to be, so to speak. All right, so in the example there where it says let Ajax change the content, if you click on it, you'll notice that what's in there changes. All right, but the thing is, all the stuff around it doesn't change. All right, and then they explain it. Okay. But it uses, if you look on this function load doc here, it's all the stuff we've been talking about. Now, can you see where I am, where it says function load doc? Okay. Some of this stuff is going to start becoming important. Not so much where it's got ready state, but you see where it says this.status equal 200? We're going to be working with status. That's HTTP status. If you get a status that's returned that's between 100 and 199, that's an information message. If you get a message or a status code that's in the 200s, that usually means success. 200 like this means it worked. If you've ever gotten a 404, typically 400 are errors. All right, so we're going to get into all this stuff as we go on. So again, for whatever reason, they waited till halfway down on the page. What is Ajax? As it says, it's not a programming language. It uses a combination of this XML HTTP request along with JavaScript and the DOM. And they show the picture as far as how it works. That's a really good explanation. All right, the picture and the 7 steps that are underneath it. So as it says, something happens, an event occurs. That's step 1. Step 2, A request object is created by JavaScript. Step 3, it sends a request to the server. Step 4, the server processes the request. Step 5, it sends back a response. Step 6, the response is read by JavaScript. And step 7, the appropriate thing happens. It's not that different than what you have with a regular request response period on a web page. But here, it's very, very dynamic. All right. You might ask for something, and you might be asked for something else. Give me more information or do whatever. All right. Then they talk about the XML HTTP request object in some depth and breadth of coverage on here. As they say, all modern browsers support it. It can be used to exchange data with a web server behind the scenes. That's why you can do the partial page update. And they show an example. If you do the change content exam or the try it yourself example in there, it's the same, just about the same one they have at the beginning of the section. All right, now look at the next thing where it says access across domains. Can you see where I am? All right. It says for security reasons, modern browsers do not allow access across domains. This means that both the web page and the XML file it tries to read must be located on the same server. The reason it does that is for security reasons. If you were able to be on one web server and write something out to another web server or grab something, etc., you could do damage, and it would be almost impossible to prove you did it. Older browsers, basically, they don't support it, or they have minimal support. They say how Internet Explorer 5 and 6 use an ActiveX object. It's not that big a thing. All right, the request object methods are shown about 2/3 of the way down on the page. Okay, and are we going to use this? Not a lot, but we are going to use stuff like I said, like the status that gets returned, and they show this down on the bottom of this slide. They show some examples. They say for a complete list, it says go to the HTTP messages status message thing, and they show all of it. If you go onto that, they show the 100, the 200, the 300, the 400, and I think they're even 500. I think that's all there are, though. All right. Send a request to a server is next. As it says, the request object is used to exchange data with the server. You do get the idea, right, that what we're talking about here is to be able to do stuff dynamically. A lot of times you'll hear it said that you want to be able to do it in real time. So in other words, you know, I ask for something, I get it immediately. I want to change something, I change it immediately, etc. Get and post. Are you comfortable now with the difference between get and post? Get basically is like a select. You are retrieving information, but you cannot change it. Now, what's typically when we're talking about working with an API like we're going to be doing, when you do a get, what you're asking for is give me all the information. So give me an entire list of employees. You know, it's not that you can't, but typically when you do a get request, you're asking for everything. All right. On the other hand, when you're doing a post, it's typically one thing. Because with a post, you're adding something. What you're going to notice when we get in and start talking about Node.js is there's not just get and post. There's delete, there's put, and there's something called patch. And put and patch are almost the same thing. They're both updates, but we'll talk about that when we get to that point. So they have a get request example in there, followed by a post request example in there. All right. Then underneath that it says asynchronous, true or false, and it says server requests should be sent asynchronously. All right, we are going to be working with async. We are, you can force something to happen asynchronously by, for lack of better words, prepending an async tab. When you use async, you use another word with it called await. We're going to be getting into that in about 2 weeks. The server response is on the onReady state change. And again, we already talked about some of this stuff as far as statuses, but when you look at ready state, if you look at that chart that's on there, what does it say? Well, you can get a 0, 1, 2, 3, or 4 back. Ideally, you get back a 4, which means we're done. If you get a 0, nothing's happened yet. What I don't understand, for example, when I use this Camtasia product. Sometimes I don't know if it's how many people are actually, if it's the bandwidth around here or what's going on. Sometimes when I'm working on a video, I can produce it and I can get it done in 10 minutes. Sometimes I can do the same video and it takes an hour. All right. All right, next underneath that it says using a callback function. Again, I've mentioned this term to you before, but yeah, this is another one you're going to have to become familiar with. Next week we're going to spend some time and we're going to talk about callbacks, async await, something called promises, etc. And that's going to bridge us into getting into Node in the following week. But it says a callback function is a function passed as a parameter to another function. That's a pretty big saying. It's saying you're passing one function to another function. All right? And that's totally legit in this language. So it says the function should contain the URL and what function to call when the response is ready. And there is an example in here on the try it. You click to change content. And it's not a great example. That's unfortunate because some of the examples they have in here aren't really as good as they really should be. The server response properties, the response text and response XML are shown there. The response methods, the get response header and the get all response headers are shown there, and some examples of these are shown. And just so you know, I mean, a lot of this, we're barreling through this, but with some of it at least, the reason that we're doing it like this is I'm spending a little more time on stuff we're actually going to be covering. The other stuff is just stuff it's good to know, and if you plan on trying to get a career as a web developer and you apply at a place, this is the kind of stuff you may be asked. All right. Then there's an XML example in here. I'm not going to run through this. A lot of people hate using XML. I probably mentioned this to you last semester already. But the big difference between XML and JSON is XML, you write your own tags. So a lot of people find that a very hard language to work with, whereas with JSON, it looks a lot like you're creating a JavaScript object. Why? Because JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation. All right. And there's a PHP example and an ASP example. I'm going to skip both those. We're not using those languages. So there's a database example. As it says, this will demonstrate how a web page can fetch information from a database with Ajax. All right. So notice if I grab something, if I grab Alfred's, whatever that is, Futterkist, I get all of his information. All right. If I do north-south, I get their information. If I do Wolski, etc., I get their information. But you're seeing what's happening is the page is refreshing right there immediately. All right, and it's going out to the database to do that. Ajax Applications says this chapter demonstrates some of the HTML applications using this. So again, this is just a bunch of examples. Displaying XML data within a table. All right, displaying the first CD in a div element, etc., navigating between the CD. You can read them yourself, okay? So there's a couple simple applications and some simple examples that are in there. All right, let's take a break. When we come back, we'll do the JSON, the web APIs, and the JS versus jQuery, and the other stuff I'm just going to reference, but we're not going to really go over. So we'll pick it up again. It's 1 o'clock, so we'll pick it up at 1:10.